This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome everybody to another webinar on hard facts about soft skills with HR professionals. Everybody here today is in for a treat because today we have Chris McDonell as our guest. And Chris is the president of McDonell Consulting Group, which is a licensed Sandler training center right here in the Towson, Maryland area for those of you who are in Maryland. I do know many of you are coming to this webinar from around the country, so welcome to everybody. Hopefully it's a sunnier day for you. Chris has had greater than 30 years of experience in sales and executive leadership. And I've interviewed Chris before, and we've met other times, and I know you're in for a treat because he has phenomenal tools to share with you, his wonderful experience, and we have a lot in common in that we deal with communication in all aspects of our work, as do most of us. Everybody deals with some aspects of communication. But I see Chris as an expert in this area, and we've had our conversations about it, and I love some of the things he's going to share. Today's webinar is about onboarding new employees to your corporate culture, because that's something that we have to think about. And I'd like to first welcome Chris. It's great to have you here today, Chris.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And what I'd like to do first is let everybody who has not been to the previous webinar, I know some of you were here last month, but I'd like to go through just a little bit about the organization on how we set this up. Although I am interviewing Chris, we do want it to be interactive. We want you to ask questions in the chat box, and we will respond to your questions throughout the webinar. This webinar is planned for 45 minutes. We will stop at 45 minutes, but beyond that, we'll stay here till 1 o'clock. But it is a hard stop at 1 o'clock. We want to respect your time. For those of you who have to leave early, it will be recorded for the people who have signed up for this, and you will be able to have access to that. So with that, I'd like to move on, Chris, to the first question for you. And my question is that do most companies align their corporate culture and focus on that when they're recruiting employees?
Linda, that's a great question. And really, when you think about corporate culture, what happens is the onboarding is just a direct continuation of that recruiting process. And there are times where the recruiting process might just be to fill a seat in an organization. It could be sales, operations, and any part of a business. And sometimes it's by necessity, sometimes it's a very quick hire without looking at the corporate culture. And typically when that happens, it can tend to backfire. And when it backfires, it's felt in many places in the organization, and of course there's a lot of cost around that. So during our webinar today, I'm going to spend some time diving into some of the areas that involve obviously culture, and why culture is so important when you're recruiting. And once you get somebody on board, why it's important to have an onboarding plan so they know exactly what to expect.
I have a question, and we can ask this of the people who are in the audience. Do you have a plan for onboarding? And if you can just put in yes or no, it would be interesting just to see what people have in their own organizations. So do you have a specific plan for onboarding? Well, I know I see Christine McDonell is saying yes, so I think that's very good.
That is good. Absolutely.
Okay. And it seems like I'm seeing most of the responses, they are saying yes, that they have a process. And I know your intent is to give more suggestions on what they can add to their toolkit as far as what they can do when they are having the onboarding of employees.
Absolutely. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to provide 4 tools. And these tools are very tactical tools that can be implemented right away in a business to help with that recruiting to culture and onboarding. With onboarding, there's been many times where I've been in a corporate environment. It could be with a client or with a group of people. And let's just say there's 10 people in the room, 10 executives in the room. And I could ask a question. On what day would you expect X employee, whoever this is, in whatever position it is, to be adding value to the organization? And if there's 10 people in the room, as what would typically happen is there are 10 different answers at times. Some people might say 1 day, some people might say 30, some people might say 90. When you have a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas of when someone should be productive, it can lead to confusion, if that makes sense.
Well, and confusion, not just for the organization, but for the employee, right?
Absolutely.
When are they supposed to take control and be, or what are the expectations of them? So again, it comes down to the communication and letting them know what they need to expect. So what are some of the things that, also you have here the determining new employees, what their needs are and recruiting aspects of it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to a culture, sometimes we have to think about the fact that, is there a culture defined? Are there values defined? And in just a few minutes, I want to go over the first tool as far as making sure that your organizational values and beliefs are lined up in the organization. So when you do recruit, you're actually recruiting and testing it against that corporate culture. Now, let me just go to that right now so we can start talking about the first tool. And again, everyone's going to get this tool. It's a writable PDF. And the power of this tool is when you think about in your organization, every organization will have either written values, core values, written beliefs. If they're not written, then perhaps they're just kind of known in the organization, or maybe they're not even known. So that could be a step one, to identify values and beliefs. So leaders should, number one, really identify whatever values they have. A value could be, we are committed to growth. That's one of our values, as a matter of fact. A belief could be, we are the number one source of whatever it is in our business. Now, the question is behaviors that you engage in to demonstrate that belief. So what are the behaviors? If a leader is committed to growth, what are they doing to continually learn, continually grow themselves, to challenge themselves out of comfort zones? And the only way you can find out how your organization feels about that is to really ask questions. Ask them questions, seek input, be vulnerable. And the answer is, it's okay if the answer is not, oh yes, you're perfect at that. So once you have that information, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna jump out of the slideshow real quick and come right back. These are core values that in our organization that we work with, these 5 core values. We've worked on these over time. And so when we're looking to recruit into our business, we have to be sure that we're looking at these. Committed to excellence. We are committed to growth. Initiative. Humbly confident is a very important one in our business, and engaged. And I'm happy to share those.
Talk to me a little bit about humbly confident, and what do you mean by that?
I'd be happy to. From that standpoint, confidence is key. Conviction is key. The problem is sometimes that conviction and confidence is almost put through in a way where you have to say how smart you are. You have to prove that you're a subject matter expert by telling people how smart you are. The problem with that is it's not very humble, and it's basically telling people versus displaying in your actions, being vulnerable. It's okay to fail, and making sure that in your organization, people realize that you truly walk the walk when it comes to that.
And that makes it easier, I'm assuming, with those values, that when somebody comes on new, that it's okay to make some of those mistakes in the process of becoming proficient in what they need to do.
And to your point, if you're not failing, you're not learning. And obviously there's certain degrees of failure in an atmosphere in any company that can be critical or not critical, but failure is key because there's so many lessons learned. Mm-hmm. So the first tool, Linda, is to really take a look at your organizational values and beliefs. And as you think about that, I'm going to spend just a second on this. When you're hiring, just from a hiring perspective to the culture, recruiting, interviewing, and inventorying that, and assessment and decision making. Oftentimes, it can be our gut feeling around an employee as we bring someone on that can lead to challenges down the road. Are there some diagnostic assessments that are used to determine, are the skill sets needed in our business, do they match what the diagnostic assessment says? And that's not the only way, the only tool, but it's an indicator. And lastly on that, with interviewing, I sit in on quite a few interviews with clients, and over the years, I've seen obviously really good interviews and interviews that may need some help. Sometimes someone might say, "Are you a good people person?" And if they want the job, they're naturally going to say, "I'm the best people person in the world. I love people." Loves people. Check the box. Well, obviously that doesn't really dive into behaviorals, and does that match up to the corporate culture and that organization, and asking a behavioral question. Are there any questions around this before we move on to the next part and the next tool?
I don't see any questions right now, but we'll wait to see if some come in. And again, the behavioral interview, and we're speaking to an HR audience, so they know this, but I was always surprised that it used to be just tell me about your background, tell me about the hard facts on your resume. And now it's become so important that these soft skills or essential skills are what's going to make or break that hire, whether it's going to be the right fit. And so it is the soft skills. And I'm seeing that we find that out by the behavioral questions.
Absolutely.
And everybody here is not HR. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the behavioral questions in an interview?
Absolutely. Typically, you might start with, tell me about a time where you're in a situation with a customer and they challenged you with something that you didn't know the answer to. Or tell me about a time when you're in a sales situation where the prospect was only concerned about price and they weren't budging. What did that sound like? What did that look like? It's really getting them to go back in time to relive a certain situation they were in, to describe their actions and describe what that looked like in the best way and the best vision for you, so you can determine if that matches up with what they say they're good at, with what they've done in the past.
And it even speaks to the idea of storytelling, because as they tell the story, we get a good sense as to who they are, and we remember them better because we know how they perform in situations. So
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of credibility to that.
And to that point, Linda, when you think about culture and recruiting and onboarding to your culture, in some organizations, it could be that there's a lot of specific rules, very specific rules that need to be followed, versus relationships. So in that particular, in business ABC, what's more important? Rules, processes, procedures, or relationships? Other times it could be group dependent or individual dependent. In some organizations, it's, can someone work, do people work on many tasks at one time? Or is the culture more, we work on one task at a time and get that right? And I think a lot of those things are overlooked when you think about culture, because it goes so much deeper. One other thing to add that I find as a top one is emotions. In some cultures, displaying emotions is quite frankly frowned upon. In other cultures, it's okay to express your emotions and to talk through things. And it's really about mashing that up during the interview process.
And you just mentioned something that made me think. You're talking about cultures, and I know you're talking about the corporate culture, correct? But
yes,
we look at the diversity of the workplace, and we're dealing with so many cultures of different countries and different ways that people communicate and different work ethics. And so I'm assuming it becomes so complicated when you're interviewing people who come from different cultures, not just from their previous job, but from their culture, from the country where they came, and what their communication style might be or their work ethic might be. How do we deal with all that?
it's very challenging. And to your point, when you think about a different cultures, diversity, when it comes to diversity, many people think of just the things that people think about typically, your male, female, ethnic origin, etc. There's so much that goes into diversity. It could be military background, your creed, what you firmly believe in, religious background, you name it. There's so many different things in diversity. We all walk the same hallways when we get up. When I leave this webinar, I get up and I walk my hallway. The hallway is the same, but my reality is different than somebody else's because of that background. And that's why companies need to make sure that the culture that they have, and we're going to talk about that next, is recruiting to your corporate culture, is making sure that the culture you've defined You're asking questions to determine if they're the right fit. And if they're not the right fit, then they shouldn't continue with the interview, with the recruiting process.
So it's incumbent on you to be prepared for the interview with the questions that are going to attract the talent that you want for your organization.
Absolutely, 100%.
A lot,
100%.
a lot to think about.
Yes, it is.
Just tell me your history and your background and why you're good for this job. But it goes
Right.
beyond. And it reminds me of the classic iceberg picture. We see the top of the iceberg, and there may be things up there, but there's so much below the water that we have to pay attention to or find out about if we want to fully work with that particular person, because we have to understand all those pieces. And there are a lot of pieces. There's a lot more psychology in sales and hiring than I think we ever believed years ago, maybe decades ago. So there's a lot to think about.
100%. One of the things that someone told me a word a long time ago, actually it's 2 words, mutual mystification, or another way to look at it, psychological expectations. Sometimes during the recruiting process, there's a expectation that either the company, the interviewer has, that's completely different than what the potential candidate or the interviewer has. And when these expectations aren't lined up and we're not transparent with each other as far as how to match it up, then what you find out very shortly after they're on board, that it's just not a good fit. And that's not good for anybody, because it costs a lot of money for one, and there could be some damage control, number 2.
Okay. Chris, a question came up, and about the tool that you already shared with us, and they asked if this would be something that could also be shared with contractors as well. Who uses this tool?
Who uses the tool?
Well, as far as you're using it within house for an organization to decide their values, is it something that if you have let's say subcontractors that are working?
Oh, yeah. Great question. Okay, it's the same applies with channel partners. We have a lot of clients with channel partners, subcontractors, and absolutely. And there's a degree of how important is that relationship to that company. Is it an exclusive relationship with that contractor? Are they only dealing with that particular company, or do they deal with many different companies? I think that's number 1 to determine how deep this goes outside of the main company. But by all means, when you're partnering with subcontractors, with channel partners, it's really important for them to be in line with the corporate culture as well.
So due diligence, know who you're dealing with. Okay, I know I interrupted you and you had something else you were going to talk about, so it's all yours.
Well, when you think about that, I think that ties in directly, Linda, to really recruiting to your corporate culture. And back to that question, whether it's a subcontractor or a channel partner or anyone they're working with, they represent your company in a more direct way than indirect, because many times they can be the face of your company. So you have to be really, really, really careful with that. Now, this next tool is recruiting to your corporate culture, as it says. Now, the breakdown with this is it's really important, number 1, to understand the position you're hiring for, the function you're hiring for, number 1. Then number 2, thinking about your organizational expectations and values, that would go on the left-hand side. And then truly where the rubber meets the road is number 1 and number 2. Number 1, list the behaviors for this position that are consistent with those expectations and values. So flexibility, customer focus, and expert consulting are the ones that are on the wall in that organization, the ones that are printed and well known. Then let's put those expectations that are expected. Now, the gap could be in number 2, and this is huge. Identify the behaviors that are most reinforced in your organization through promotion and compensation. So what's the difference? Number 3 is consider the difference. Number 1 is this is what we're saying we're going to do with our core values, with our values. Number 2 is what actually happens. In other words, maybe number 2 is, you know what, we recruit based on likability. if the hiring manager really likes somebody, or if they're hiring someone that looks just like them, instead of really thinking about what does this position need, what makes sense, and the list can go on and on. So this could open up a lot of opportunity to understand, are we truly recruiting to our corporate culture, or are we ignoring that and recruiting based on individual needs in the organization and not as a whole?
And Chris, just to clarify, you're saying 1, 2, and 3. Do you mean, because it's hard to see some of the top information on these blocks, do you mean 1, 2, 3 being the coral, the green, and the mustard, if those are the colors? Is
Correct.
that what? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I like that, Linda. Mustard. I like that. So yes, listing out the behaviors for that position that are consistent with the expectation and values. Now, this does not mean that, number one, this does not mean that they're actually done, that they're executed. It just means that these are the behaviors that would match up to the values.
Mhm.
Number two is what's really happening in the organization, what's really happening. And it could be completely different, maybe not walking the walk as far as does it match the actual values. And does that make sense?
Yes, and what you could do that would be helpful to me is if you're talking about flexibility. So if you can go across and explain that with that example so we can see. So you're talking about the value, the attribute of flexibility, and then when you get to the green column, you're saying we are flexible. I mean, that's what you look for, correct? Could you just read those off so we can hear those?
Absolutely. So for this position here, it is flexibility, and obviously probably adaptability goes along with that, being able to change at a drop of a hat. We are flexible to client needs over our needs. Now, that's number one. The mustard, number two, is communicate in the style of the other person. So there could be, that's good, because that says that we are actually doing it and we're walking the walk and we're actually going to that and identifying with that client. So there's no discrepancies. There's no discrepancies at all. And it really depends on, in that organization, how people are recruiting, again, versus how it should be done. And is there a disconnect? And this reinforces, are we actually recruiting to our corporate culture, or are we paying lip service to it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the blue, when we get into the blue, or the periwinkle, if let's go through colors, I would say. And what does that say at the top, Chris? And if you can just read the example.
The example would be good, no discrepancies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that means we're set. There's really no there's no challenge there. The hiring manager is in line with the corporate vision, the corporate values, and they're not hiring people based on their perception. They're hiring people based on what's written and in the company.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then where do we end up? What does that say on the final column?
And then number four is rewriting those values that are consistent with the actual behavior. So do we need to change the actual behavior? If it's consistent, should we change the behavior? Or do we need to actually readjust the values? Okay. And if we need to readjust the values, let's get everyone involved in that company to make sure we're bringing people on the right way. This tool we've used many, many times, and what it exposes especially in a decentralized operation, it might be many different locations where everyone has different ways of recruiting, and a company can be a little bit puzzled why certain areas have a lot of high turnover and others don't. Well, they have their own way, own way of doing it that's not living up to the values of the organization. And this will help, for lack of a better word, expose that.
Mm-hmm. Right. That sounds, and everybody will have access to this tool. That they
Absolutely.
Can,
Absolutely.
how often should you be revamping this tool or looking at it and making changes with it?
The short answer is it depends. The longer answer is every year as a company goes through their strategic planning, which should be every year, they need to look at it. How does their next 3 to 5 year plan look? Do they have growth goals over the coming years? Are they changing jobs? Are they Or is there a chance there could be an acquisition on the horizon? So every year at a minimum, you'd want to look at this, look at your values, make sure your values are in line, make sure, again, it goes back to the first tool, that leaders in that organization are actually walking the walk when it comes to the values. And then when we're hiring people, are we truly recruiting to those values or paying it lip service? So once a year at a minimum.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, I'm not sure if I'm jumping away from what you're talking about, but you're talking about onboarding of new employees. What about the person in the organization who's promoted to a different position? How do you deal? Do you use similar timelines, or tell us a little bit about how you address that issue? Because it is onboarding onto a new position, even though they're in the same organization.
Absolutely, and yes, we are going to cover that in just a little bit, but let me talk about that right now because it's so important. That's an area that typically gets, I'll just say, taken for granted, and we see that quite a bit in any company where someone is a rock star in one position, they're not knocking it out of the park in one position, and maybe they get promoted to the next level up in that certain in that area. It could be sales, could be operations, could be whatever. Well, there's a lot that's taken for granted. Since they were good in this role, they'll be good in the next role. And what happens is that there's a major disconnect and oftentimes disappointment. You take someone and take them out of their current role and put them in a different position in the company, it's even worse because then they don't have, the learning curve's not there. They haven't learned new processes, new procedures. So the onboarding checklist, which we'll show a little bit, will help nail that down, if you will, as far as what behaviors need to be demonstrated, what behaviors need to be actually written out, and what time frames they should be at performing those behaviors.
So that we're not just haphazardly moving into a position and figuring it out as we go along. We have
Correct.
somewhat of a roadmap on what to do.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we'll definitely dive into that.
Okay.
So if there's no questions on the recruiting to your corporate culture, and I will say before we leave this one, you need to really, in a business, say if a business has 10 people and there's 2 people involved in the hiring process, then those 2 people need to be intimately involved in this. If there's again, it could be sales and operations, you don't want to have this done in a vacuum. If there's 20 people, 30 people, 100 people, 200 people, then all the key leaders really need to be involved in every department. So because corporate culture applies everywhere and not just in one department.
Right. Great information. I'm sure that tool will be very helpful, no matter what you call colors.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, one of the things that I just want to touch on before we get into some of the next tools are really identifying non-negotiables. And in certain companies, a non-negotiable may be, and this is very popular today, working from home or not, or working from home 1 day a week, or that gets extended to longer periods of time. What I see very often is that with technology, there's some companies that have discovered that there is a major benefit of someone working at home. Other companies that may rely on such a collaborative atmosphere, maybe it's I'll put a marketing or advertising agency, for example. That's what I'm thinking about right now, where having everyone together more often is so important. As someone working from home, perhaps it might be a more difficult time. So that's an example of a non-negotiable if it applies to that company's culture.
Great point. And I know so many people have the conference calls, and I always encourage them, if bandwidth will allow, to have the virtual calls where you're seeing the people, because you can still brainstorm on a virtual call, but if you're not seeing people and watching them and picking up body language, you lose so much of that creative process. Even though the creative process may just be ideas, you want to be able to see what people are thinking of your ideas as you explain them. So I know there's so much with remote training, remote work, but I encourage meetings to have the video if the bandwidth allows it. I know with global companies, that's sometimes an issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the words mutual mystification can come up because Oh, I just assumed that they knew that, or I just assumed that, and I don't know about you, Linda, and anyone else on the call. A lot of times when I assume, I am absolutely wrong. So assumptions can get you in hot water.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So were there other aspects of this hiring funnel that you wanted to talk about before you moved to the next tool?
No, I think at this point, I'd like to talk about really when you have to make a decision to hire somebody. The reason I wanted to share this tool, and these tools are in a series of tools in our leadership or organizational excellence program. This hiring decision matrix really takes into consideration what we call the search model. And the search model, as you see on the screen, again, these tools will be shared. What are the skills necessary for someone to be successful in this role? What type of experience should they have? What about the attitude? Attitudinally, what do they need to be like? What type of results should they have had in their previous role? Whether if it's in sales, would they have had to have met quota? If it's in operations, what about timely task completion? Just examples, high-level examples. Cognitive abilities, if it's a certain requirement that they have to use. Excel at a very high level, for example. Their habits, their work habits as far as how they view their day, time management, and various things around their habits, what's important to that company. And then really, when you take those different aspects, what you do is, and another way to write this out would be to make sure you have all these things written out specifically as far as what they are. But let's just say you have 4 candidates that you're looking to bring on. Bill, Kim, Martin, and Sally. You're ranking them based on the skills, experience, attitude, results, cognitive abilities, and habits, and you're giving them a score. At the bottom, you'll see if you're using any type of assessment, a DISC assessment, a Divine assessment. What do they look like? What does that person, how do they compare to somebody else? And then basically you have a candidate total score. And when you have that, at least it gives you a higher degree of an indicator as to, are they a fit for our organization? Linda, I don't know if you have any questions around that, or if anyone on the call has any questions around that.
No, but this certainly speaks to soft skills.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at all these different soft skills, and you're just mentioning things like their work habits, their time management, their communication, and all of these. They may have those hard skills, but the hiring process certainly looks at the soft skills, because if they don't fit with everybody else, it's not going to be a successful hire.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are there any questions, or is there any question you want to ask of the audience, Chris? Do you want to poll anything as far as, I wonder if anybody is using any specific tool, and maybe they can post what tool they might be using that helps them in the hiring process. And like you said, it could be the DISC, it could be something else, but I'm curious what some people, if you can type in a tool if you're using it, and if you're not, just type in no, that you're not using a tool right now.
That'd be great.
Today you'll have a tool to use. So people can type in what their responses are. I'll just watch them as we're talking and let you know what I'm hearing.
Sure. And Linda, just to really emphasize this particular tool, again, going back to that gut feeling, and I want at the bottom of this tool, it leaves a spot for gut feeling. Because that's why it's so important, because that is an important part of it. Someone might say, well, that person that just didn't feel right. Okay, well then let's put that down there for whatever reason. What does that mean? But let's not have that be the total decision-making process. And what this does is it helps you break that down, especially when you have multiple candidates that you're looking at that all seem to have the qualifications for the particular role.
And what about the several interviews in one day, or several people interviewing? So it's nice to get different people's feedback on that.
Absolutely.
Chris,
Absolutely.
It's interesting to see that the people who have posted say that they're not using any specific tools. So hopefully this will be very helpful for them to give them some idea of what they can do. And it sounds like you're supplementing this with a DISC assessment or some other formal assessment. Is that correct? Or okay.
Yeah. And to your point, Linda, this is in this example, this just shows the first for Bill, he's an IS, influencer study relator. Kim is a dominant conceptual, and a DISC is an indicator, whereas a high I is more outgoing, a high C may be more not as outgoing. Maybe they want to work independently. A DISC is not going to be used as a hiring decision. The skills-based competency assessments like Divine, MBTI, which we have not used MBTI. We stick with DISC and Divine in our business, but the Divine is more of a skills-based competency assessment.
But to your point, the gut reaction at the bottom says a lot, because they could look good on paper and you just don't have that feeling. And usually those feelings pan out, that if what you thought in the beginning, very often you do see later down the road.
Absolutely. And I will say one more thing on hiring assessments. Using a skills-based hiring assessment like Divine, for example, truly helps reduce hiring mistakes. There's nothing that can totally prevent a hiring mistake. An assessment tool that's validated, like something like Divine, and there's many assessment tools out there, really help you determine what are the key competencies in your business for this position, and does this person's do they match those competencies? And it's a very effective indicator that over time will save companies a lot of frustration and a lot of money.
Great. Now we have about 8 minutes left for the formal part of this, so I want to make sure you get to the tools that you want to share with everybody. So I see you're on the onboarder right now, so why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And this is the fourth tool. The onboarder is really, it goes back to what we mentioned when we opened the call. And to reiterate that, especially in an organization that has a lot of different moving parts, there's different expectations that some people have that are different than others as to when someone should be fully productive. This is one example of an onboarding plan. So for this particular role, this sample, what's important to master? Our products. This is a salesperson. They need to understand a 30-second commercial about their business. Qualifying questions by product, to have talk tracks around whatever they're selling, a product or service. In our world, a good upfront contract is an agenda for a meeting, as so that prospect knows what to expect during this meeting and what everyone's role is. I'm not going to go through all of these, but all of these are what's important to master. Now, in top of that, if you look on the bottom, there's reasons to test, top producer characteristics, and non-producer characteristics. Now, and I'll send this form out. It's a 2-page form, and the key is that when you use this, you're actually putting dates on the timeline, and it can be done in many different ways. The sample just has them written there. You can mark off the dates when they're due. It also needs to include who needs to, is it the direct manager that needs to be with that employee to make sure that they've demonstrated that skill? Is it a mentor that's assigned to them in the business that helps them with that, and they can help verify it and validate it as well? So when that's done, after say 90 days through a 90-day onboarding plan, it would also include meeting other company department heads, meeting top customers, working with suppliers, subcontractors, channel partners, whatever the business calls for, but it's a plan that they can go back to, and it's repeatable for all the positions in that organization.
And it makes the new hire or the person in that new position more accountable that this is the expectation. So when you do have the problem, you can use this as the tool that this is what we agreed to. You needed to be proficient in these areas, and what happened.
Absolutely.
I'm being the negative person, but it's a great reason for that. Or on a performance review, these were the expectations, and look, you met some of these before. You were completely proficient before we even expected that. So it is a nice tool actually for the employee and the employer to use.
And to take that a couple steps further, when someone leaves an organization, and I've seen many exit interviews in my time when I was in the corporate world and over the last 12 years with this business, with our clients, what the number one reason, without a doubt, across the board, that's a non behavioral issue or issue outside of what someone could be doing unethical, would be I did not know what was expected of me. I was thrown to the wolves. Go out there and sell. Go out there and lead these people. Go out there and understand these products. Just thrown to the wolves.
Mhm.
And when that happens, because someone may hire somebody that says, you know what, they have, I'll use sales for example, they have 10 years sales experience, so I don't need to do anything to onboard this person. They already got it. Let's bring them in, let them start selling. Well, oftentimes that's a recipe for disaster.
Mhm.
Perhaps they have 10 years of experience, but maybe it's 1 year of experience 10 times. So are they committed to that ongoing learning? Are they committed to that? And they're just thrown to the wolves. So again, you can apply that in any position. I'm very passionate about that because it's a huge reason why people leave organizations, because they weren't properly onboarded and into that culture.
And your key point, into that culture. So they could have 10 years of experience in sales, but not along the expectations and the missions of that organization. So
Absolutely.
that's so important. That's
And,
great.
and,
When
and to
people
that
get,
just I want to use that word, those two words one more time, mutual mystification or psychological expectations. Well, I just assume that, and it goes back and forth, and it can be very, very challenging.
Mhm. Now, when you give this tool to everybody who's attending, are they getting the sample or are they getting a blank tool? How are
They
you?
are getting a blank tool. Yeah, the while the sample looks pretty, it won't be very effective. They'll get the actual blank tool that has, and the tools are writable PDFs.
Mhm.
Writable PDFs allow you to document everything on the PDF and then obviously save it. I was told a long time ago that two things are important. A writable PDF is important because you can use it ongoing, and anything that's laminated is important. Well, I'm not going to say anything laminated, but the writable PDFs are going to be coming your way.
We can't laminate them through email yet.
Not yet.
Okay, was there one other tool, Chris, that you had, or was that
This was the fourth tool.
this
Yeah,
was the
this
fourth
was.
one? Excellent, excellent. So there are certainly so many tools you're giving that hopefully will make the process easier for everybody here who's listening today. Are there any other suggestions that we haven't talked about, maybe unrelated to the tools, that they need to know or to make them perform better in the onboarding process?
Well, I think the next step with this is really just understanding when they come on board, what needs to happen with them during their onboarding, during their 90-day process. And really, when you think about that, improving training effectiveness, I guess you can call this a bonus tool, is really just understanding what are the different things in pre-training assessment that we're doing, what are we doing in actual training delivery, and what are we doing in post-training support. So as someone's onboarded to a company, whether it's internal training, whether they're sent to somebody outside the organization that's outsourced, whether it's product training, soft skills training, what can we do in our organization? What are our current activities and responsibilities, as you see here? And what can we do to improve? And this is a nice, I guess I call this a litmus test to determine the training effectiveness in the organization.
And you know that's near and dear to my heart because I do that type of training with organizations to help them if it's somebody with communication issues or not listening well or not speaking in a way that would be effective in their workplace. So that's wonderful to have that resource as well.
Absolutely,
It,
absolutely.
It's now 12:45, and we're here until 1 o'clock if people have questions, but this is the formal part of the webinar. And I can't thank you enough, Chris. I think these tools and this information and knowing your expertise in this area has been invaluable for everybody. It's a wonderful, it crystallizes so much of what you need to do in the onboarding process and to understand the culture. So I thank you for all of your time today to share this with the audience that we have here today.
It's my pleasure. Really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the time today.
Sure. And do we have questions? Does anybody have questions, or even if they want to post what they might do differently because of what we talked about today? So perhaps people who are in the call, in the webinar, can type in, what is the takeaway? What will be different because of what you just heard from Chris? And if you have questions, you can type those questions in. I'm watching the chat board and we can respond to that. For those of you who do have to leave, thank you for attending. We appreciate your being here. If you have colleagues who want to hear this and you know it would be beneficial to them, you will be getting the recording of this webinar. So thank you for attending. And again, let's see, we have Colleen. It said that they're the more structured process. Okay, great. Thanks, Colleen, for that information. So hopefully this gives us, rather than willy-nilly, somebody's new, let's see if we can get them on board and get them comfortable. Now we have some measurable ways and to be very concrete, so we know our expectations and they do as well. Thanks, Colleen, for that. Are there any questions of anybody? Any other takeaways? Okay, well, I don't see. Chris, did you have any questions of anybody in the audience at this point? You covered so much, I don't know that you have questions.
I would just say that when you get the tools, is to sit back with the tools, look at them, understand the tools, talk to the other leaders in your company about them, and really make sure that everyone's on board. The first tool in particular can get deep with the values of the company and who's walking the walk and who's not walking the walk. So it shouldn't be taken lightly, and it should really be a thought out process as you start looking at that.
And I have one question. What size organization are these tools relevant for? I think I know the answer, but how big an organization should be using this tool? Or maybe how small an organization can use this tool?
And it can vary so much, Linda. It's a great question. It could be an organization that has been in business. It could be a solopreneur that wants to make sure that they are hiring in the right way, that has values established for their business as they grow. It could be a $3 million company that wants to be a $7 million company. It could be it really doesn't matter. The size of the company doesn't matter. The companies that we work with, it ranges the gamut, quite frankly, because it's so important, no matter if it's product-based or service-based, it really doesn't matter how big the company is.
And I would think even the first tool is good for a solopreneur, just to sit down and think about what their values are. I am a solopreneur, I think about that, but to sit down and write it, I'm sure is a very good process to crystallize what your mission is and what your values are, and it helps you understand how you want to approach not just people you're hiring, but people you want to be hired by.
Absolutely. Because a solopreneur is going to wear a lot of hats, and it can be very challenging with that. Which hat do I have on now? So it's good to have something to look back on and to have those values established.
Well, that's great. Well, again, thank you so much. I don't think we've gotten thank yous, but no other questions. So Chris, thank you so much. I'm sure if people do have questions, they can reach out to you. We will be following this up with an email with a survey. And a survey, we'd love you to respond and let us know what you liked, what you'd like us to improve, if there are other topics you want to hear, if you want to have Chris back for another level of this or another topic, please let us know. We love the feedback. That's all part of communication. And if you have questions of either of us at the completion of today, feel free to reach out to both of us.
Absolutely.
So thank you, everybody. Again, thank you, Chris. Great
Thank you.
information. I'm sure everybody has some takeaways that they'll be able to use even this afternoon if they choose.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. See you, everybody.
My pleasure, Chris. Bye-bye.